Hi everybody, my name is Des and welcome back to another album review. Today we're reviewing the latest record from Vampire Weekend entitled Father of the Bride. Now Vampire Weekend is a pretty interesting and unique group that has a lot of quirky characteristics to their music that makes it really fun. They tend to have very wild, memorable songwriting and pretty significantly powerful instrumentals that make them a really memorable group overall. And going into this album, even though the singles leading up to it didn't have that same wackiness, they had a nice, blissful simplicity to them that led me to believe this was gonna be a really good album. And in a lot of ways it is, but in a lot of ways it really isn't. There are some really good tracks on here. For example, the song Harmony Hall, which is one of the first singles of the album, has this really beautifully calming and soothing instrumental and some really thought-provoking lyrics that cover ideas of religious insecurities and uncertainty, wondering about having all these snakes in a holy place. And to me it's a really interesting, introspective, and deeply thought out song that I think really shows what this album could have been. I also really love the song This Life, which covers the idea of a very complicated relationship and where he admits, you may have cheated on me, but I also cheated on you. I've been cheating my way through life. And he takes this time to reflect on not just the relationship at hand and the difficulties that have ensued through it, but also the difficulties within his own life and all the struggles that he has to face each day and how he's been cheating himself out of a really fulfilling life. And it's a really interesting song that, much like Harmony Hall, has a great instrumental, really well thought out lyrics, and a great vocal performance. I thought the production value on This Life is really fun, it's really catchy, and it's really enjoyable. The song How Long is another highlight on here, which has, once again, a much similar minimalistic style of sound that has a slight popish but still has a definite alternative feel to it, that has this idea of a failing relationship, where he's saying how long until we sink to the bottom of the sea, saying how long are we going to keep this relationship going? It's obviously failing, we're obviously going to sink, we're just going to hurt each other. How long are we really going to keep it going? And it's once again what I think is a really well thought out song. And even though I do think there could have been a bit more depth added to in the themes of the failing relationship, to me it's still a solid lyrical song overall. The song My Mistake is another fun one on here. Where I do think lyrically this one does struggle a little bit, where many of the lyrics are talking about him making this big mistake and it's ruined so many things for so many people. And even though I don't really think it's all that important what the mistake was, he does make a few references to what it could have been, but there's no real specifics given through the song. I wish that there was a more detailed and a more extravagant story of the effect this had, maybe on specific people in his life, maybe even on himself. I think that could have allowed this to be a much more diverse and much more interesting, beautifully deep track. And even though I don't think it's bad, to me, a lot of the lyrics just come across as a bit surface level at times. But I think the really graceful, beautiful pianos that gently drift into this acoustic segment of a very similar tone transitions really well. I think the instrumentals on this cut are absolutely phenomenal. The song Sympathy is another really good song. I really love the groovy, funky, aggressive, not really aggressive, but really just high energy bass line and guitars that go into this. It's unlike any of the other songs on this album, even though I could see how one might find it a bit distracting or a bit out of place on the album. But I actually think it works really well through the whole thing. It has a very unique, tone and style to it that really does make it a powerful song all the way through, with very strong themes of course, having sympathy for other people around you. It's not all that deep or interesting, but it's solid and has a positive message overall. The song Flower Moon was probably the main other song that I enjoyed on here. I thought it had a really fun, unique, and interesting instrumental. I thought some of the vocal performances on here were great, especially the very deep, slow, and soft vocals that are presented midway through, or in between the first chorus and the second chorus. I do think it could have been improved in some areas here and there. Maybe some of the instrumentals could have been beefed up a little bit, but overall, it's a really great song in my opinion. It was really fun all the way through. And even though it seems like I enjoyed a lot of the tracks on here, which I did, this is a pretty long album. It borders on about an hour long. There's 18 tracks ranging from about a minute and a half to over 5 minutes long. And most of the other songs on here I found to be really subpar. And if I'm being honest, the main factor is Danielle Haim. I believe it's pronounced Haim. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. She's featured, her vocals are featured, I should say, on a pretty good number of the tracks on here. And very rarely does she ever bring anything interesting to the table. The opening song, Hold You Now, offers a really bland and forgettable vocal performance from her, and many of the songs that she's on are about relationships and love, and whether it be the struggles of it or the joys of it, she tends to just be really bland and uninteresting. She adds absolutely nothing to the songs, other than maybe a couple of decent harmonies here and there. She really doesn't add anything on her own. She, if anything, detracts from the songs with her lack of energy, her lack of interesting lyrics, and I'm not entirely sure if she's the one who wrote her verses, but so many times I think that the verses that she sings, especially with the rest of the Vampire Weekend crew, are so ridiculously corny. Songs like We Belong Together and Married in a Gold Rush are so disgustingly cheesy, and they don't even sound all that good. It doesn't have any sort of the sweet, blissful, loving vibe that the lyrics are trying to portray, but it just feels underproduced. They took this idea of trying to be simple, overly simple, minimalistic, way too far on some of these cuts. It just comes across as really boring. Especially the song Married in a Gold Rush, I thought was pretty corny all the way through. Oh, who's your baby? Well, if you don't know by now. It's just really stupid and corny. And again, We Belong Together is another just cheese fest of a love song. It's nothing that hasn't been done for the past century. Bambina is another weak cut on the album. This one, along with songs like Big Blue and 2021, are very brief, not even exceeding the 2-minute mark, and none of these really stood out to me as anything all that special. Bambina probably being the worst of the three, where I found a lot of the vocal melodies, especially the to be really frustrating on the ears. The production wasn't even all that interesting. The guitar riffs are okay, I guess, but it really does nothing to excite, nothing to get the energy up, nothing to really contribute to the album whatsoever. Big Blue is another somewhat boring cut on the album. It really doesn't do all that much instrumentally, doesn't do all that much lyrically, talks about the ocean and just repeats the same verse literally 4 times throughout the entire song, and that's it. The same 4 lines 4 times in the song, and it's boring. The production is uninteresting. Pretty weak song. And 2021 was probably the best of the 3. It definitely was the best produced, definitely had the best lyrical content of him reflecting on if he'll still be remembered 2-3 years from now. But it still just lacks any sort of oomph to the album. It doesn't add anything. It just kind of starts to flicker up, and then the flame dies down after the minute and a half the song takes up. It doesn't allow itself time to really develop into much of anything, and it leaves effectively no impact whatsoever. There were a few other weak tracks on the album. Unbearably White, much of the same story. Something like Big Blue is just an overall boring cut, in my opinion. The instrumentals are a bit too stripped back, a bit too minimalistic, and it just doesn't do all that much to excite, and something doesn't have to be really upbeat or exciting to be nice. I mean, take for example the song, I believe it was My Mistake, which was really, really calm. I was either that one or Sympathy. I'm sorry. There's a lot of tracks on here. I get them mixed up a little bit. It had this really nice, beautiful, soft piano with those really glistening acoustics like I brought out earlier, and it definitely wasn't overblown. It definitely wasn't all that energetic, but it was a nice, calming, beautiful cut on the album. And I wish they had either stuck with their fun, kind of upbeat and happy songs like Harmony Hall, maybe had a bit of the high energy of something like Sympathy, and mix that well with the calm nature of My Mistake. And unfortunately, it just fails at being any of those. The song Unbearably White. Rich Man is another weak cut on here. I thought the lyrics almost came across as pretty pretentious at times, where, saying how, 1 in 10 rich men are unsatisfied, I guess, or only 1 in 10 rich men are satisfied with their life. I guess I'm that 1 in 10, huh? And it just feels like a bragging song without any sort of cleverness or ingenuity whatsoever. It just feels boring. It feels really self-centered. It feels really pretentious. I don't care for that one too much. But really, the album starts to take a nosedive towards the latter few tracks on the album. I already talked about 2021 and We Belong Together, kind of opening up this weak, shaky part to the conclusion. Then songs like Stranger are just really forgettable all the way through. Song Spring Snow, even though I thought it had some nice instrumental moments at times, the instrumental does get pretty irritating as it goes through. And Jerusalem, New York, Berlin is a really forgettable, boring closer to the album. Doesn't do really anything. It has, I guess, a couple of interesting lyrics at the least, but I find the instrumentals to be dreadfully boring. I find the vocal performance to be really underdone, and it's just a really disappointing cut on the album that I think really could have been improved. And again, I don't think this was all that bad of an album. There were plenty of songs in here that I enjoyed, and even some of the ones that I've been criticizing a bit more I thought were still alright overall. There weren't a whole lot on here that I just absolutely couldn't stand. Really, the main bad things about this album were anything with Danielle Haim on it, if I'm being honest. She was easily the worst part of this album. The instrumentals were pretty solid throughout. The vocals were consistently good. Again, there were a few songs here and there where they were a bit weak, but they still had good moments at times. I just wish that they were a bit more consistent with this. But overall, like I said, this was a solid album for sure. I know I'm being kind of harsh on it with a lot of the songs I didn't care for, but I feel like Vampire Weekend can just do better than this. I'm feeling a strong 6 on this album. If you checked it out, it's still an enjoyable listen all the way through, and I think it's at its best when you just have it on in the background and you're not really paying attention to it, because it is relatively pleasant on the ears overall. But as soon as you start to look into it with any sort of depth, it quickly falls apart, and I think that's where this album really does fail. It is unable to be listened to intently in an enjoyable way. So with all that being said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the album. Tell me how wrong my opinions are as always, and I'll see you in the next review.